Hello, my name is Amanda Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. This podcast features recordings of talks that were given by scientists at events in the Pacific Northwest. These events and this podcast are created by VIA Productions, and we here at VIA think that both science and beer are pretty awesome, and the combination of the two is even better. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast or how to attend one of our Science on Tap events, please check out our website at viaproductions.org.
You know, the circumstances in which a body wouldn't have weighable organs, that's the worst kind of circumstances you could ever have. And that's what I usually deal with.
That was Dr. Nikki Vance in her talk, I Dig Your Bones, Adventures in Forensic Anthropology, that we recorded at the Kiggins Theater in Vancouver, Washington. Nikki is a forensic scientist and the state forensic anthropologist for the Medical Examiner Division of the Oregon State Police. As you might expect, given what she does for a living, much of what Nikki talks about is kind of gross and also super interesting. I've synced up her slides with the audio file and uploaded this podcast in an M4A format, so depending on what device and app you're using to play this episode, you may be able to see the slides as we go along. A warning though, some of the images are a bit disturbing. If you can't or don't want to see the slides, don't worry, it's still a fascinating talk. And she's pretty freaking hilarious.
So I would love to tell you a little bit about my job. I have different facets in regard to what I actually do, but I'm going to give you an idea of what I do on just one facet, really one cog in the wheel of being a forensic scientist and the state forensic anthropologist. So I work for both organizations, and I know we're on God's side of the river. I'm going to talk a little bit about Washington State as well. Actually, my mentor, Dr. John Lundy, was the head of the anthropology department at Clark College, and so he always called Washington God's side of the river, so I always refer to it as that. I work for the Oregon State Police Medical Examiners Division and for the Forensic Services Division. I'm a forensic scientist 75% of my time, so I work on physical evidence. I'm a crime scene analyst. I'm a case manager for our forensic science unit or our forensic biology unit in Portland. In addition to that, I am the state forensic anthropologist for our Oregon State Medical Examiners Division. This is our building in Clackamas, right across the street from Costco. I am half Costco hot dog at this time. So what I'll do first is I'm going to tell you where I came from. A lot of people wonder how you get a job like I have. Who gets a job like this? I'm from Montana. Thank you very much. Yeah, yes, absolutely. The last best place, let's put it that way. Specifically, I am from the little town of Missoula, Montana. Yes, right on. Peace out to you, sisters. So I grew up not really unusually for a Montanan, but you know, I mean, it is what it is. This is the kind of thing that I saw, you know, during every fall and winter. In my younger years, I don't know if you'd say popular was a word that I was. But you know, I had some talents. And so when I was 10, I won first place in a mime competition. Yes. And I would like to point out, so this is, if you're wondering what kind of child grows up to be me, this is the kind of kid. I would like to point out the Jesus with the Sacred Heart in my bedroom. This is my bedroom, and the Building a Rainbow poster. I don't know if any of you had that. So I won first place for a mime titled Shopping with Mommy. And I remember, oh, believe me, and I would hate to call your attention to the pleated jeans, the high-waistedness of them, and the little clampy red hands that are on the bottom of my rainbow suspenders. But I can't help but point that out because this, I think, was May of 1980. And on Halloween of 1980, I decided to recycle those suspenders and be a clown. Could this not be the creepiest 10-year-old child you've ever seen in your entire life? Oh my God. And may I point out something else in my home in Missoula, Montana, by the way. Remember where I'm from? This is a picture of Joan of Arc in my living room. Right below it is, of course, the cardboard cutout, the skeleton, and then creepy effing 10-year-old child. Nobody dresses like a clown, but apparently I do. So I obviously grew up in a Catholic family, and so that really screwed me up. And, you know, we do things differently. We do things differently. So I was out in the woods a lot. We were looking at dead animals. My dad was a hunter. I have fished all my life, things of that nature. So this is really where I come from. If you want to know the background of the people that do what I do, this is, kind of standard. We're not really scared of a whole lot of anything. And you kind of have a propensity for liking really the elegance of skeletal material. So again, this is where I am. So hold on, here we go. We're going to go ahead and get on into my job. To give you the career path that I really took, I have a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Montana. Thank you. I love the fact you're here. I have a master's degree in anthropology from Portland State University. It's also my alma mater. And I have a PhD in anatomy from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So let's talk about death investigation and the role anthropology plays in that. So lots and lots and lots of different facets in a death investigation. And again, this is one very small cog in the wheel of really the holistic approach of investigations for, say, homicides or suspicious deaths. You've got a lot of people listed up here. First responders, death investigators, our medical examiners, our forensic pathologists, cadaver dog handlers, search and rescue personnel. And so I am really one part of this entire system that investigates suspicious deaths in Oregon and actually in Washington State as well. So, we've got a lot of fiction out there as far as popular culture goes. But, the fact of the matter is we do have a lot of fun on our job, and we try and make it light. And we try and really, get a little levity in the kind of things that we do. And this also is fiction. I think this person is supposed to be a medical examiner. We do have a state medical examiner in Oregon that is a female, and she just kicks ass. Oh, by the way, I swear. So there's that too. I always forget to say that until about halfway through, and it's like, oh, FYI, I'm a pirate. So this apparently is supposed to be a medical examiner, but that body looks nice, doesn't it? This body does not look so nice. This is the kind of case that I work on every day. When a body doesn't have weighable organs, that's when they give it to me. So you think about the circumstances in which a body wouldn't have weighable organs. That's the worst kind of circumstances you could ever have. And that's what I usually deal with. And now you know why I drink. So this is another fact of my life. Mummified remains happen all the time in Oregon, usually on the eastern side of Oregon and in Washington State. But this is the kind of thing that we look at. And so to discern something meaningful and investigatively evidentiary, if you will, in something that looks like a jumble of stinky tissue and bone is really a challenge. And we're working at a deficit there based on the fact that we can't recognize a face here, and we might not be able to get a fingerprint from this person. So we have to use different techniques when we're looking at skeletal remains in order to do those types of things and further an investigation for our detectives and for our law enforcement. So forensic anthropology is what I do. And the first question I always ask is what I'm looking at bone? I get PVC pipes submitted to me. I get those crazy little white landscape rocks submitted to me. I know, seriously. I mean, it sounds like a rock when you tap it on the table, but believe me, there's some people that think that it actually might be bone. But you have to determine whether or not what you're looking at is bone first. So if it's bone, is it human bone? So these are the kind of questions I ask myself. That's a huge question. Is it male or female? Do I have a dude or do I have a chick in front of me? If it's human. And what was their age at the time of death? How old was this person when they died? What's biological group? We'll talk about race in a little while and talk about how we can discern some biological affiliations from skeletal remains without knowing what someone's skin color is. It's not very easy based on the fact that we're all pretty much, we are all the same breed, if you will. How tall was this person when they died? How long have they been out there? What kind of trauma or pathology is on these bones that can give us an idea really specifically who they are? And again, a lot of these people are unidentified when we receive them at the medical examiner's office. So one of our first tasks is really to identify who they are. Who is this person? And that's going to give our detectives the kind of clues that they need in order to further their investigation. So human versus non-human, we have our darling quadruped here. And obviously there are differences in an animal that walks on 4 legs versus an animal that walks on 2. So this is our veritable biped. We look at things like cranial structure in human versus non-human. That sounds kind of straightforward or simple or silly. But humans really are the only mammals that have this huge brain case to fill our big fat brain that we only use 12% of. In opposition of that, as you see kind of the example of a goat, you see a very tiny brain case as well. And you see obviously a lot of differences there. We've got kind of that prognathism, that mid-facial projection through the goat, and obviously some gnarly teeth as well. This is an interesting picture too, because we see a lot of characteristics that appear human. We have eyes that face forward, that aren't on the side of the head skeletally, that eye orbit structure. We have a big brain case. We have a jaw that sits under the nasal aperture or the nose hole, and we don't see a midfacial projection there. And those are all human traits, things that I would note as distinctly human. But when you look at what we would consider very classically human, which is on your right, you can see there are differences, but there are also quite distinctive separations in morphology. Morphology being physical characteristics. So that's a rhesus monkey. So we've got monkeys and we've got humans that have a lot of the same traits. And obviously higher primates look a lot like us in their skeletal morphology as well. They're very dense and musculature and robust, but they have a lot of physical traits that we have as well. A couple other characteristics that I look for, especially in the field when we're out searching for someone, we're looking for vertebrae and ribs and scapula, shoulder blades, collarbones, long bones. And we have to have people in the field, like myself, that know human morphology versus non-human morphology. So this is an example of human versus non-human. Human again on your left, non-human on your right, and we're looking at the spinous process of the vertebrae. And usually in humans you have three. You've got these transverse processes here and here on either side, and then the spinous process is this projection here. In humans, it's about equal to those other two transverse processes. In non-humans, you'll see a very, very long, skinny, gracile projection coming off of the back of that rib, and that gives me an idea that it is in fact non-human. Again, we've got some physical characteristics to this vertebrae that would give us a clue that it's non-human on the right and human on the left. Did I get that correct? Yes, I did. So we've got big, chunky morphology in quadrupeds, animals that have to walk on four legs, that have to have kind of a stabilizing structure along their spinal cord. So there's big, big hooks on these vertebrae, which helps stabilize that vertebral column and in essence helps allow that thoracic cavity to be stable and be robust. And we sit upright, so we don't necessarily need the effects of gravity or the effects of that those stabilizing hooks to keep our thoracic cavity and to keep our organs in place. So these are ulna, which are little forearm bones from a human and a couple non-humans as well. So you've got some humans on your left, here and here, and this is the non-human equivalent from two different species. Don't ask me what they are, I don't know. I know human, I don't know anything else. So you can see the morphology, the physical characteristics are the same. You see that little half moon-shaped depression? That's very, very indicative of an ulna. All mammals have ulnas, and they're shaped like this, but the scale is different. So the ulna in a cow is going to have the exact same physical characteristics, going to be a lot bigger, but it's going to have the same things to look for. So again, there's that little moon shape, and this is actually a cow ulna, and there's that moon, and there's that moon. So when you're looking at a rib cage, you're looking at the way those ribs are shaped. And again, because we stand upright, we have this cavity that's very open, and our ribs are shaped, have a nice kind of arc curve to them that's very, very undulating and very, very common, if you will. It's the same all the way through the rib. That's because we stand upright. We have to have really this cylindrical thoracic cavity. In opposition or in contrast to that, you've got, again, quadrupeds who stand on four legs, who have a lot of gravity that is pulling their thoracic cavity down, and so they have a very, very elongated and skinny thoracic cavity. So you can imagine that the ribs are going to be shaped differently. They're going to be a little straighter, they're going to be a little more robust in through this section, and they're going to have a curve right at the very, very end where they attach to the vertebrae in the back. That gives us an idea that what I'm looking for is, in fact, non-human versus human. So this is a look at a quadruped from above, and you can see how skinny that rib cage is, comparatively speaking, to humans. Hands and feet are different. You really have to know your hand and foot bones, being human versus non-human. So when you see a hand and a foot bone of a human, you can tell what's particularly human and what's non-human. This is an interesting case in the fact that we found a couple of these hands, if you will, in a recycling bin. And this is pretty creepy when you find something like this in your recycling bin, wouldn't you say? And they look like hands, most definitely. But when you turn, and with the desiccated tissue on there, and it does not smell like lavender, believe me. So you turn this little hand over, and you see these crazy muscle attachments in through the back portion or the palmar portion of this hand or this palm, and you see that there's just this very, very strong, robust morphology on the back palmar surface of this. This is a bear paw, where the claws have been cut off for black market purposes, and they've been cut off at the wrist and they've been discarded. But that is one of the main indicative morphological characteristics of non-human versus human, and we see a lot of bear paws that get discarded in landfills, in plastic garbage bags by the side of the road, which is super duper creepy as well. So you almost have to x-ray these because they almost normally have tissue on them, and of course the claws are gone because those are of value on the black market as well. So you don't have the claw to say ding 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 ding, holy, okay, yeah, I guess that's not human, is it? So there they are, comparatively speaking, and you can see they've got a lot of the same physical characteristics. You can count the fingers, you can say, well, which one's the thumb? That's crazy. But they do look very similar at first blush. So if we've determined something is human, the next step is whether or not it's male or female, because that's going to exclude 50% of our population to look at in regards to identification purposes. So we're going to look at dudes versus chicks next. So the most accurate elements in order to tell male versus female in human skeletal remains is the skull, which is both the cranium and the mandible. There's two parts to your skull, and the pelvis. And these are the two skeletal elements that will really give you differences or sexual dimorphism, if you will, between males and females. Muscle attachments, projections, shape, and morphology will really be different between males and females. And that's through developmental processes, of course. So we're going to look at this frontal bone, and we're going to look at this supraorbital ridge. It's very, very chunky and robust in males. It's very gracile in females. It's almost what we call a persistence of juvenile traits in adult females, meaning it's a very high vaulted forehead in adult females. And again, dare I say low and sloping for you men out there. The supraorbital surface, actually, if you run your thumb along the supraorbital ridge of a cranium, that has a very, very distinct morphology. In males, it's rounded and, again, very robust. In females, it's very sharp and dainty, if you will. So if you've felt that a lot, you know exactly what you're looking for, and it's really a non-metric trait to look for. In addition to that, we have chin shape. Men's chins or males' chins are very, very squared off, and females tend to be more pointed. So here's kind of a schematic of there's that sloping brow ridge. Oh, my brothers would hate me. And here's the angel-like, high vaulted forehead of the female. And also, we look at muscle attachments. We have all sorts of muscle attachments that go down in through our neck and the back of our heads. And one of the main ones that I look for from a non-metric perspective or from a visual perspective is your occipital protuberance. So girls, if you put your hand and you feel that little bump on the back of your head there, it's probably pretty gracile or pretty diminutive, if you will. Now, touch your neighbor. Don't touch your neighbor. Don't do that. If there's a male beside you, feel the back of his head in comparison to yours. Or if you need to meet someone tonight, or if you feel lucky, feel that. It's much, much bigger in males. So, fellas, size does matter in some very, very small ways. And then there's just sometimes there's no question. Sometimes it's just classic male morphology. Yep. In addition to the cranium and the mandible, we have the pelvic morphology that gives us a lot of information about males versus females. Obviously, because females have this wonderful ability to shoot children out of their pelvises, and men unfortunately do not. And so our physical characteristics down in the nether regions has to be different in order for us to get big-brained children out of our vaginal vaults. Yes. So in females, and I just say that like I'm talking about a bracelet. Out of the chute, everybody. Okay, so females have this wide subpubic angle, and that the subpubic angle, in fact, your pelvic bones is comprised of 3 actual bones. You've got the left and the right pelvic bone, and then you have the sacrum in the back where everything attaches. And if you've ever had SI joint pain, that's your sacroiliac joint, and that's where your sacrum, which is this crazy little tailbone here, meets the ilium of your pelvis. So that's what SI pain is, sacroiliac pain. In any case, I digress. Females have this wide subpubic angle, again, to allow for a big brain childbirth. And we also have what's called this wide greater sciatic notch that's indicative of females as well. In contrast to that, males have a very narrow subpubic angle when both of those pelvic bones are articulated together. And in addition to that, their greater sciatic notch is definitely more narrow and more chunky in morphology. So we can look at those and really automatically see that male physical characteristics coming through as opposed to female. So we've answered the fact that it's bone, we know that it's human, and we know that it's male or female, but one of the things that's going to progress our investigation with this individual that we've found at this point is how old was this person when they died? So we age at a very, very standardized rate as humans, as males and females. So we can show the progression of age through our skeletal remains. So age determination is based really on growth and development in juveniles. If you've got a younger individual, we'll see those growth plates or those epiphyseal articular surfaces, as Amanda was talking about, fuse into their cartilaginous minions, if you will, and become obliterated, and I'll show you an example of that. So we have our long bones that become fused at each end during puberty. We have our skull that is fusing at those suture points when we're a younger child. We have a lot of things developing and growing as we're toddlers and juveniles and into our years through puberty. And really, once we hit puberty, you have now developed secondary sexual characteristics or osseous characteristics, and you basically stay static as that young adult, really through your young adulthood, through your 20s and through your 30s. I hate to say this because it affects me as well, but in that 4th decade of life and beyond, we see degenerative changes that are happening at that point. So really the most challenging people to age at the time of death are the people that are in their 20s and 30s. And usually 40s, it's pretty much all downhill. So juveniles really, I mean, in all reality, children have a head full of teeth. And here you can see the development of the adult teeth in the actual jaw in what's called the alveolar space, and the existing deciduous teeth that are past the gum line at that point. So this is a horrible case from South Africa, but I thought I'd show this to you as well because you can see that adult dentition that is developing in those alveolar spaces in both the maxilla and the mandible. So this is a busy slide, but it just gives you an indication of how tooth eruption, and if you have kids, you've seen it all before. You know exactly when the molars come in. You know exactly when the incisors fall out. I mean, when your 6-year-old loses his first central incisor, you know, and everybody takes pictures of it. And it's got that dangly little blood vessel that's super grody. But this is the rate in which deciduous teeth are lost and adult teeth are gained. So, and it happens at a very standardized rate. So we can look at the tooth loss or the tooth gain of a juvenile and narrow down the age range. Epiphyseal fusion is what Amanda was speaking to a little earlier, and that is the layer of cartilage between the shaft of your long bone and really the cap. Do you remember having they called it growing pains in your legs? That's because you're growing and probably you're just about ready to hit puberty and your epiphyseal lines are becoming more osseous and less cartilaginous. So if only you had known those words when you were 13 and you said, Mom, I'm ossifying, okay? Leave me alone. I don't want any broccoli. So that layer of cartilage between the bone and the cap is again ossifying. So the cartilage turns into bone and that line will disappear. So again, you see no visible line once you've hit adulthood or once you've gone through puberty. So the epiphyseal plates have fully fused and that line will obliterate. And let me show you an example of that. So here is 3 distinctly different aged humeri. Where's your humerus? Okay, and that's right, and the plural is humeri, thank you very much. So here you've got, I think this is a 4-year-old, and you can see the little button of the epiphyseal cap that had not fused on this humerus when this child died. So that cartilage has decomposed, and that button, that osseous button has remained along with the shaft. In contrast to this, you've got a teenager who is just ready to fuse, and you can see that epiphyseal line ossifying from the internal structure of that long bone shaft to the external structure of the long bone shaft. So this is a teenager. Here's our 4-year-old, here's our teenager, and this is a fully formed adult. That epiphyseal line completely gone, completely obliterated. So as you can imagine, if I see that line where that visible epiphyseal plate is connecting to the shaft of the bone, I know I've got a young adult on my hand. And if I see those little buttons of bone with very dainty little shafts, I know that I've got a juvenile. So you can narrow it down in your head and really take a holistic approach based on how many skeletal remains or how many elements that you have in order to develop a biological profile on this individual. Here's another rendition. This is the femur, so the right femur of the exact same people. So your 4-year-old is on the bottom there, and you can see those little buttons or those little plates that have not fused yet. And here's your teenager. You can almost see the line there, and there's that very distinct epiphyseal line on the distal end of the femur. And there's our fully formed adult. And you can see where the line probably was, but again, it's completely obliterated. So age after early adulthood, again, it's all downhill basically from there. We stay static through our 20s and through our 30s, but we do see degenerative changes. We see disease, we see osteoporosis, and we see our bone density decrease, especially in Caucasian females. So there's a lot of things that we can look at, though, in order to age these skeletal remains and narrow down even an advanced age range when we find unidentified remains in the woods. So this is a vertebrae. This is a lumbar vertebrae, and we quite often find degenerative changes in those vertebrae in the lower back. So this is called osteophytic lipping. And, you know, if you're kind of depressed at the fact that you're getting older, just think that all of these diseases have super great names. I mean, osteophytic lipping. I mean, that's good stuff right there. Too bad that it's, you know, these bone spurs that form on your vertebrae and cause some incredible pain, but hey, whatever, right? Hey, I've got lipping in my back. It's not bad. So all of these bone spurs are indicative, again, of osteoporosis or degenerative changes in the lower back. Osteoporosis can also be seen in the hip joint. It can be seen really just about anywhere in the wrist joints or the articular surfaces of the wrist, anywhere where bone spurs can occur. And there's a lot of different variation as far as why we think that happens. And really the general common consensus is the fact that as our bone density decreases, our bones obviously get more fragile, and then we are getting little microfractures at those points that are under stress, the wrist, the knee, the hip, the ankle. And what does your body do when you get a fracture? It heals it. So it forms this little bone spur. And so you see these nodules of bone in older people that you don't necessarily see in younger people because they have a higher bone density. Super simplistic, but that's the way it goes. And then there's this. I mean, this guy could be 32-year-old from Estacada, or it could be 68-year-old, you know, from Estacada. I mean, who knows? It doesn't matter. But usually when we see edentulous individuals or people with no teeth, we would instinctively think advanced age. So how tall was this person? We do determine stature as forensic anthropologists as well. And every long bone in your body, believe it or not, is correlated to your stature. We consider bones of the hand also long bones. They're really short long bones, but they're long bones nonetheless. So you can measure finger bones, and there is a correlate, a statistical correlate to your stature. It's not very good, and it gives you a huge stature estimate, but the best bone to measure for stature is really your femur. Second best is probably your tibia. Third best is probably your upper arm bone, your humerus. So every long bone in your body correlated to stature. So we have a regression formula that we can plug into with the measurement of, and this is an example of how to correlate that long bone measurement directly to your stature. So these are formulae that are developed to determine an estimate of stature. So, 5'7" to 5'10". So we take the measurement of the humerus. This is an example of the humerus. And we have a plus or minus 3.72 centimeters. And so we get, again, a stature range between 5'7" and 5'10". So does race exist? So we've determined stature. We know it's male. We know it's human. We know that it's, say, a 38-year-old, between 38 and 45-year-old person. How do we know what race this person is? And as an anthropologist, sitting here in front of a bunch of super smart people drinking beer, do we discuss the issue of race? And does it really exist? The word race, as anthropologists see it today at this moment, is a social construct. It doesn't have any biological background as far as we're concerned. So we're all Homo sapiens. We're all the same species. And so if you're using the word race synonymously with the word species, then I suppose you could use it. But again, as you well know, the word race has some very, very negative connotations. And it's been used throughout decades and eons to denigrate people. So the fact is that there are different populations in the world that looked different from each other based on their skin tone, based on their hair and other physical characteristics, because they live in different geographic locations. And it's the geographic location, it's that indicator that gives us an idea of someone's biological affiliation or their geographic affiliation. So no, race doesn't exist, not in a biological context. It still exists in a social context. So that's really kind of where we're going with that. But we call it, as anthropologists, biological affiliation. So again, it's that geographic location from where your ancestors came from that gives us an indication of what you might look like in life. And remember, you're skeletonized and in the woods right now. I mean, I hate to bring that on you right now. So skeletal analysis has no direct evidence for skin color. And I have made mistakes in the past in regard to this, talking to detectives and talking to law enforcement about what this person's skin color might be. I get it wrong. So we can't talk about skin color in regard to anthropology. So osteological traits of the skull can vary. And we're talking about the skull. From the neck up, we can see different traits from different geographic groups. From the neck down, we all look the same. So European ancestry, we can see the European ancestry exhibit itself in cranial facial features, and this is really how. And it's basically eye orbit shape and the shape of the nasal aperture, also known fondly as the nose hole. So we see European eye orbit shape kind of droop in the lateral corners on the sides, almost like an aviator shade shape. And when you look at a skull and you can see that aviator shade shape to those eye orbits, most often than not, you are looking at a European skull. So there's that aviator shade shape there. And with Europeans, you'll normally see a nasal aperture that's twice as tall as it is wide. And again, that's just a biological trait of that geographic location for Europeans. Black Africans are distinctly different in the way their eye orbits are shaped and the way their noses are shaped. And that manifests itself in their soft tissue as well. Sometimes, a lot of the times, you'll see Black Africans or African Americans have a wider nose aperture or nasal aperture than Europeans. So the shape of, say, a Black African skull or cranial characteristic are more squared or rectangular, and that's going to give you a better idea that what you've got in front of you is an African or an African American. Also, the measurement of the nasal aperture is going to be about the same in regard to the height versus the width, so that ratio is almost the same. So there's that eye shape that we're seeing. Asian ancestry, these used to be, you might be wondering why I'm not talking about Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, because those are an affront to my sensibilities, and I just don't like using any of those words. And so I'm talking Asian, I'm talking Black African, and I'm talking European at this point. And you will see a trend of just eliminating Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid from anthropological literature, hopefully, in the next decade or so. We want to get away from it because the connotations there are disturbing at best. So Asian ancestry, we see some interesting things with Asians. This is also indicative of Native Americans because, genetically speaking, they are descendants of Asian populations. So you see, interestingly enough, a very, very complex suture pattern in the back of the skull, and that's really indicative of an Asian population. So Europeans or Black Africans have a more meandering, simplistic looking suture pattern. So again, if you see this very complex suture pattern, you're more likely looking at someone who's from an Asian population. Ultimately, what I do when I'm trying to determine biological affiliation of a cranium in front of me is what's called quantitative analysis. Nobody's going to believe me, and neither will you, based on the fact that you kind of know me now for like a half an hour, and I'm not quite sure if you believe anything I'm saying right now. But nobody's going to believe me if I say, because I say so. I have to back up my determinations and my estimations with data and with statistics. And that's how all forensic science is at this point. So my quantitative analysis deals with cranial measurements that I take that I plug into yet another regression formula that we talked about with stature. So 29 cranial measurements are taken from different points on that cranium and put into the formula. And based on the ratios between those numbers, my formula comes up with the probability of what this person's population is. So it'll say 95% probability that this person is actually European or of Asian ancestry. So that determines, again, that probability. So we have statistics to back us up at this point, and it's not just because Dr. Vance says so. So 29 cranial landmarks we use and we measure between every single one of them, put them into our regression formula, and attempt to determine or estimate what that biological affiliation is. We're trying to identify this human being. If we don't find a wallet in the degraded pants that are there with this skeletonized person, we're trying to determine who exactly this is. So what happened to this person? What physical characteristics on their skeleton could be an identifying factor? And these are the types of things that are very, very discriminating or individualizing. As you can imagine, a prosthetic, as you're seeing up here, you see lot numbers or serial numbers that can be on a prosthetic, which is here on this radius. And that's going to give us an indication to go to a hospital, go to x-rays, try and find that lot number, or try and find that exact pattern where this is screwed into the bone, and determine again who this individual is. These are some pictures from South Africa, which are some gnarly fracture patterns that did not set well, but they're very individualizing. So I'd like you to squint at them if they look too gnarly for you. But look at the crazy fracture pattern in this terrible set in the fibula. So this is a tibia, your lower leg bone, the big one that you knock on the coffee table at night. This one, you can see that there's a prosthetic that's been almost all absorbed in some skeletal material. So it means it's been there in that person's tibia for a while. And then the corresponding fibula, which was broken and not set correctly. So if this was x-rayed, and this person showed up by the side of the road skeletonized, hopefully we'd be able to determine, based on the other things that we've determined up to this point, female, 18 to 25, Black African, we can narrow things down. And who's missing? Who's missing in the area? Find that person's x-rays and see if this is their tibia and fibula. This is surgery by heavy metal materials, who knows? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screw heads that are hammered into the head of a femur. So lovely looking, isn't it? South Africa's got some gnarly things, let me tell you. I would be in the osteology room and open a box from a case and just be like, ah! So it was very exciting as an anthropologist. And no, I'm not married. Single, you don't say. Do I need to show the mime picture again? Yeah. Anywho. This is ankylosing spondylitis, which is this crazy candle wax spine, and it happens in the United States too, but it's much more prevalent in South Africa because it's an inflammatory response in regard to poor nutrition as well. That's one of the factors that can cause ankylosing spondylitis, so candle wax spine. But again, very, very discriminating and very individualizing type of characteristic. This is the other femur of the dude with the other screws, this guy. So this is the left femur, this is the right femur. Could you just pound that one in a little farther? I mean, really? You had to leave it out like that? If you know anything about bones, and if you've ever broken a bone, if you've ever looked at an x-ray, if you've ever had an x-ray taken, I'd like to call your attention to this huge bone spur that's wrapping around that screw at the bottom. This person has lived with this injury and with this type of hardware for probably years, because really your body is trying to stabilize that location, and that's an inflammatory response right there. So again, better living through power tools, apparently, as far as South Africa. And these are some stabilizing rods that have been shoved up the shaft of the same femur. So, yeah, it's horrible, isn't it? That's why I show it to you. That's why you came here, right? Oh, and there's the side shot of this one. It's the same thing. Yeah, there it is. I don't know why you needed 3. They all look like they're doing the same thing, don't they? Yeah. Let's get one more up there. What do you say? It's kind of where you sit there and you're like, okay, wait a minute. There's 3 on the table. Should we just use 3? Yeah, let's just use 3. Anybody have an idea what this is? It's your kneecap. It's your patella. What is it screwed to? Why did they use screws? It's not screwed to the front of the tibia. It's not screwed to the distal end of the femur. It's just 2 screws going from the inferior portion to the superior portion, and they're just 2 screws that are coming up from the patella. I have no idea what this is doing, but I thought I'd put it in there. Bad femoral break. This is looks like left femur. Bad break, did not set well. This is the top of a cranium. You can see that suture pattern right there. Any idea what this is? Syphilis. This is what syphilis will do to cortical bone in the cranium. So, holy treponematosis. Yeah. And then you've got processes that are not natural or unnatural or prosthetic. And really what we're looking at here is this divot, which is a healed hatchet wound. Again, from our lovely country of South Africa. So our goals with death investigation and anthropology really is identification. So I've given you all of these tools that anthropologists use to identify the remains that we have in front of us. We have additional goals though. Is there perimortem trauma? Are there things that we can see in the bones that will give us an indication of the manner or cause of death? And that's what my forensic pathologists and I do. Is there a possible cause of death? How did this person die? So again, that's cause and manner of death. And we see, in addition to natural deaths that are, out in the woods and people just expire and skeletonize there, we do see perimortem trauma, or at the time of death trauma, that is induced by either other people or by the person themselves. So gunshot trauma is one of the things that we see. This is generally characterized by radiating fractures because you've got a lot of energy behind that projectile. You've got really a distinct entrance and exit wound through bone if it has hit bone. Sometimes bullets don't hit bone, they just go through soft tissue. And you'll see widespread fragmentation on some of the... Oh, another picture of my neighborhood. Yeah, so there's Montana IA for you. So gunshot wound trauma, again, can look very different, but it's categorized by some of the same general classic things. So this is actually a natural hole. This is called the incisive foramen. We all have this. There's a blood vessel that goes up through your hard palate. Everybody's got one right in the middle, right behind your maxillary central incisors. This hole, not so natural. That's not natural. That shouldn't be there. That's the entrance gunshot wound in a suicide. And here is what we would call a secondary entrance into the superior eye orbit of that same individual. In addition to that, we see sharp force trauma. Anything that a knife might hit as far as osseous material is concerned might show in some vestige of that sharp force trauma. So you'll see linear defects, something that's sharp that's caused by a knife or a hatchet. You'll see partial thickness defects or fragmentation, something that doesn't go all the way through bone and doesn't fragment it or have radiating fragmentation. So you'll see specialized fragmentation that's only in one little area. So, such as a hatchet mark. So we're looking at the top of the skull here, and you can see kind of a depressed fracture here, but they're not radiating through the skull. And again, here's an additional fracture here, and then a kind of a blown out fracture there. And that's all sharp force trauma. This is a case that we worked about 5 years ago that's been adjudicated, so I can show it to you. But this is also sharp force trauma with a hatchet. You can see that very linear mark there. And this is a radiating fracture that was created by the force of that hatchet going through the cranium. There's another view of that same cranium, and you can see the linear characteristics of that. And you see a little pointed in there. That's where the edge got caught. And all of this material was fragmented below. The next picture is grody, so watch out. This is the same individual's knee. So you can see there's a bit of a defect here. Just a tiny, tiny defect. And don't look at the rice around here, because that's not rice. This guy sat outside for about 7 days, and there was some serious insect activity on him. But what am I talking about? That's the queen's we. I boiled down his knee so we could see the actual defect in his tibia and in his the distal portion of his femur. So what you're looking at here is a hatchet mark basically on that same red line trajectory, and this is that corresponding hatchet mark right there. So it took the bottom of his femur clean off in this location. He did not survive this. Yes, no. Again, sharp force trauma. And what we're looking at in this slide is this, the body of the sternum, so right there in the front of the sternum. And these are both very, very distinct stab wounds, so puncture wounds to that sternum. And if you can tell just a little bit, they're more squared off at the top and they're sharper at the bottom. And so that's a single-edged knife that goes straight through that sternum. In addition to all of that perimortem trauma, or trauma that's caused at the time of death, we see postmortem trauma as well, and you've got to be able to distinguish between the two of them. So you've got characteristic scraping tooth marks. Remember those striae, or the channels that the rodents make? That's very characteristic of postmortem trauma to skeletal remains. Puncture tooth marks by carnivores. This is another example of postmortem carnivore scavenging damage to a scapula, so your shoulder blade. Very fragile bone, but it does survive well in the field unless a dog or a coyote gets a hold of it. And this is just a stereoscopic photograph of that disorganized fracture pattern on a rib that's been gnawed on quite a bit by rodents. Or you could have post-mortem damage such as this, and this is by fire and heat. And so very, very destructive. It will burn all of the organic material out of bone. It will warp bone to the point where you can't determine what exactly you've got in front of us. And this is a homicide case that we worked a couple years ago. But you can see the bone is cracked and warped. And this is a plastic rendition of vertebra bone. So that's a human thoracic, like a mid-back bone, but you can see the morphology is the same there. And this is an example of those transverse fractures that are caused by heat. And remember, we were talking about whether or not you can tell if something's fleshed or whether or not it was skeletonized when it was burnt. So here's those curved transverse fractures, and they're usually along long bone shafts. And that's indicative of musculature that's still attached to that cortical bone layer, because the muscle contractions, the fibers or the striae in the soft muscle will contract and then form these curved transverse fractures. So you know you have a high moisture content in the bone when these fractures were created. This is the same case, and I've got a plastic skull out to give you an idea of where this tiny little bit came from. That's probably the size of an Oreo cookie. So these are cranial facial features that we found in a burn pile, and really what this is one portion of a cheekbone, that maxillary frontal bone on the right side of this individual. In addition to that, we found a very small degraded portion of this individual's mandible, and so you can see it's right there, and this is the portion that you're looking at, is that ascending ramus, that mandibular fragment. In addition to that, we found some pelvic bone fragments, bless you, and right in through here is that portion of the greater sciatic notch that we were looking at that was determining male versus female. And so it's that little arch that you see right in through there. And it took a long time to determine exactly what these fragments were from. There's a larger pelvic bone fragment that we found, but you can see that the morphology, again, is the same. You can see it even though it's degraded and even though it's not complete. So really what we're looking at is that acetabulum, which is where your hip bone sits, and that very curved portion there, and you can see there's the corresponding curve in our charred remains. And again, there's that greater sciatic notch right there and the corresponding sciatic notch in the burnt remains. Same piece of skeletal material that's been charred and calcined and fragmented, and there's that acetabulum. So we've got a lot of challenges as forensic anthropologists to try and identify someone. And you can imagine in a situation like this, it would be very, very hard to do. We've got someone who's not necessarily skeletonized, fully clothed, which is great. You might find a wallet in a pocket, which is woohoo, which has an ID in it, but it might not be their ID. That's always the case potentially. But we've got decomposed remains, fully clothed, and certainly no facial features, probably no fingerprints. And so what do? With this guy, we were very, very lucky. He had an ulna prosthetic. He had had some injury to his ulna in the past, and it was very unique. You can see kind of a gold screwed prosthetic here. And then you've got the silver prosthetic with some wires across it. I love this based on the fact that this R is for right. So the orthopedic surgeon knew which one to put on the right ulna. So it's good that they're labeled. There was, by the way, there's no lot number on this thing at all. It just had the R on it. That's not going to narrow it down, believe me. But this, we thought, certainly would narrow it down. This is the same individual, the decomposed fellow that was in the fetal position. We x-rayed his skull, and we saw something very, very classic, something we normally see in gunshot wound victims. So you see a very, very distinct radio opacity here, and then almost like a snowflake effect through here, very indicative of a gunshot wound to the head. And in fact, when we looked at the skull, we found the lead bullet that was lodged in the left eye orbit. But when you look at it a little closer, you see bone growing over the actual bullet. So this person had survived this gunshot wound. And so we're not looking necessarily at a homicide. We thought for sure when we saw this that we were looking at a homicide, not necessarily because this person again survived. This case is interesting because it took he was so identifiable with the ulna prosthetic. He had an inferior vena cava filter that was just sitting in the middle of his thoracic cavity, which is this crazy little metal shuttlecock thing that holds the ascending aorta open. And we've got this, and you have to sit there, and we thought, maybe he's a veteran. So we went to the VA and asked them to pull all the records of males that had survived gunshot wounds to the head. You'd think that it's just going to wash out. It's going to be one, right? It was like 9. There was 9 of them in the VA system alone. In Portland, that was it. So that didn't get us anywhere either. So really ending up, all the skeletal analysis that we did, all the prosthetics and all this individualizing information that we had, we ended up figuring out who it was because the investigator cleaned off the keys that were in his pocket, went back to the neighborhood he was found, and started using them in the mailboxes, and one opened up a mailbox. And then he pulled out the mail and got the name on the mail. And it was that dude. So yeah, you're never gonna see that in an episode of CSI. Seriously, And there's never gonna be a CSI Portland, people. I know you want it, but rain slickers are not sexy. Well, they can be. But in that case, think about it. I mean, as an anthropologist, I had all this information to provide to our investigators, but I didn't do jack. I mean, it's like, thanks for nothing, Vance. But these were the types of people that were very, very helpful in that particular case. We like to ID people. That's our number one goal. We like to determine how they died. That's certainly one of our paramount goals. And sometimes we have to turn to a national system in order to do that. And this is the end of my presentation, and I'd like to go through this very quickly with you because I know I'm running out of time. But I want to tell you about this, this database tonight because you are a huge part of how this is going to be successful. Everyone in America is a huge part in how this is going to be successful. And it's called the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, also known as NamUs. I know it looks like NamUs, but we pronounce it NamUs. So just a couple stats in regard to Oregon State. And these stats, I looked up Washington's and didn't get a chance to put these slides in, but they're very, very similar to Oregon State's statistics. So our medical examiner cases in 2012, which is the last period in which we have statistics, 3,900 plus some change are medical examiner cases, but we only autopsied about 884 of those cases. So not all of them are suspicious enough to have an autopsy performed on them. But unidentified decedents in Oregon is going up because we're finding more people. So as of 2014, as of today, in Oregon, we have 109 people that persist in being unidentified. So skeletal remains that persist in being unidentified. And I want to get them identified as the state forensic anthropologist. In contrast to that, is in any given day, on any given moment in Oregon, per our state stats, as of August 1st, 2013, again, the last statistic that we had, there was about 1,600 missing people listed in Oregon. And again, it's very similar in Washington State. So the numbers aren't necessarily congruent. And you know that a lot of those 1,600 people aren't dead in a field somewhere. I mean, they're just missing or they're runaways, but they are in danger, no less. So that's where NamUs, this National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, comes in. And this is the website, and I'll show you this website until you're sick of it. So I plug it into your brain because I want you to go home and cruise on this for a bit. So really what it does is compile, amalgamate all the missing persons in the nation with all the unidentified persons in the nation. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Why haven't we done this before? I don't know, to be quite honest. If you Google missing persons, you'll get 12,000 websites. You know, the missing children of Michigan. You know, the missing housewives of Ohio. Because everybody wants to help, everybody wants to do their part, but it's been so fragmented and all that information is everywhere. It's spread all over the place. This is the one place where we can put it all. It's fantastic. So one website, namus.gov, www.namus.gov. You can access both the missing persons and the unidentified persons. So it's nationwide, again, and it's free. If you have a missing son, you can put his profile on NamUs, you as his mother or as his father. If you have a missing uncle that's been missing since 1986 and we thought that Uncle Kelly was just kind of weird and he said that he was going to go to Idaho because he loved potatoes. And we've never heard from him again, which he might be in Idaho just eating, which is fine. And Uncle Kelly is free to do that. But if you suspect foul play and he's been reported missing, then he needs to go on the NamUs national website because he might have taken a right turn in Idaho and gone down to Utah and unfortunately expired in Utah, and his remains are languishing in a morgue in Utah. And the people in Utah have his remains up on the website, but you haven't put Uncle Kelly's missing person report in the website. So you see how that works? If it's going to be a success, we have to populate it. So that's what your job or your task as smart, curious individuals that are here tonight can take a look at this website. So again, it's nationwide and it's free. It's free for everybody. Everybody, $0, 0 cents. It cross-matches automatically between the parameters of my unidentified skeletal remains and the parameters of your missing loved one. If I have a 16-year-old white male in my storage unit for anthropology, then it's going to automatically find your 16-year-old cousin that you put into NamUs 4 months before, and it's going to tell you that it's a possible match. And it can be from Wisconsin, it can be from Florida, or it can be from Washington State. Again, nationwide. Free DNA testing. I send all of my skeletal elements that are unidentified to this federal DNA lab, and they automatically upload that DNA profile nationwide so that it gets compared to missing persons. So this is how it happens. Entering a missing person case is simple. Our law enforcement agencies in Washington State and in Oregon strongly encourage you, if you're going to put something on this website, to file a missing person report with your local law enforcement agency. That's where you can generate a case number and you can track it through a detective and have someone assigned to your missing persons case. But this is how we put it into NamUs. Just some statistics, males versus females on the missing person side, about the same, 50% both ways. There's more adult males in the website at this time than there are adult females, and there's more female children that are on the missing side than there are male children. This is Al Cretin from Baker City. We found him deceased in September 12th. So you can put a driver's license picture. You can put, obviously, a picture of your loved one on there, the clothes that they were wearing the last time that they were seen. This is David Durham. He shot a Lincoln City Police Department sheriff's deputy in January 23rd, 2011, and he has been missing ever since. David McVoyd is from Multnomah County. He's been missing since 2010. So we have pictures of these people, but we also have their vital statistics. We have their dental records that are in the system as well. We have pictures of their dental x-rays when they went to the dentist. We have the clothes that they were wearing. We have the vehicle that they were driving. And we ask law enforcement to collect a DNA standard from these people's loved ones. If you have their toothbrush, that's a great viable conduit for DNA, is that missing person's toothbrush, because their DNA is all over that thing. We can send that to the national lab and have a DNA profile substantiated on that. And that DNA profile can go into the national system and searched against all of our unidentified remains. So Lois White, found deceased in 2011. Little Kyron Horman, I'm sure you've heard of him. These are the types of things that our law in Oregon and your law in Washington State request law enforcement to gather. It's a busy slide, I know, but it's a lot of information that may help identify the missing people that we still have out there. Our law, in addition to Washington State's law, asks, again, law enforcement to collect a DNA standard. It can be a toothbrush from that missing person. It can also be family reference standards, meaning the biological parents of that missing person, the siblings of that missing person, biological siblings of that missing person. Any biological relative can give an oral swab standard. We can fill out the paperwork for you. We can send it to the DNA lab for free, and they can upload that DNA sample into a very specialized database. It doesn't go in and determine whether or not you have any outstanding warrants. It's just a family reference standard, so it's only listed as that, and it can only be searched a certain way. There are a lot of federal laws that protect your rights as a United States citizen that will not allow anyone to look at your DNA profile unless you ask them to do so. And that's as a family member of a missing person. The same goes for unidentified remains as well. In fact, I ask everybody's permission. Are you okay with me doing this? Good. They never seem to have a problem with it. Most of them are quiet. So any applicable information that I can gather from those remains, the things that I've talked about for the last hour, male versus female, how tall were they, how old were they, any trauma, any pathology, are there clothes associated with that? Can I take pictures of the tags? All sorts of things that I can determine. Again, estimated age, sex, stature, where the body was located. Is there somebody missing in this area? There's all sorts of things that we can put in there. Physical, medical characteristics, anything with those prosthetics, dental records, crowns, fillings, all sorts of crazy stuff. Clothing, jewelry, just anything that I can determine from those skeletal remains to put in this national database. This is an ongoing unidentified person that we've had since 2009. This is what she was wearing when we found her in the Willamette River. So these are pretty distinct pieces of jewelry. We want a family member to see this picture and hopefully recognize it. So, DNA aside, there's a lot of ways you can identify someone. Identification of dead and missing persons means that we could have a DNA standard from that unidentified remains case. Bone material is rich with DNA material. Cellular material inside of bone is perfect to get a DNA profile off of. And where do we get it done? At this national federal lab that's basically the University of North Texas. We send all of our samples there. We encourage all of our law enforcement representatives from Washington State, all over the state, to send our DNA samples to there. Again, photographs of remains, x-rays of any healed fractures, dental records, anything that we can find that might help identify this person. This is a fellow from 2001. We still have not identified him. He had an Oregon Trail card, which was the food stamp card, in his wallet, no identification, run over by the train and tigered. Young guy, probably between 32 and 34, and full beard. And so we got our forensic artist to come in and do a little nicer shot. This is not the kind of thing I would put on NamUs, because I would not want a family member to see that. It's a good thing that it's from the shoulders up, though, because both of his arms are gone. That's not what you want to see when you're looking for your loved one. So our forensic artist does a great job. She will look at the cranium and the mandible, mount it on a stand, take some digital pictures of it, and then do what's called a 2D reapproximation of this person's face. She can be almost spot on in a lot of situations, because this is the same person. And this was a young girl named Myra Cruz that we identified a couple years ago. But how amazing is that? She even got the part of her hair on the right side. And the reason she drew her with a hoodie is because her skeletal remains had a hooded sweatshirt on them. So very individualizing. Other things that she can do: she can take a nasty looking tattoo on a decomposing body and clean it up. So you can see that this is not necessarily appropriate for the website. Nobody wants to see that, but this is appropriate for the website. So a lot of things that our forensic artists can do. Dental pictures, dental records. We take x-rays of all of our unidentified remains to look at those fillings and the crowns and the dental work that that individual has had, and hopefully a dentist or someone who's looking at dental records can match the two up. And some very distinctive dental work can be seen out there. This is the same gal that was wearing the Embrace Diversity bracelets. She has some really distinct dental work, but we have not identified her yet. She also had a maybe you know her, she had a long, long gray braid all the way down her back. And she was about 65, she'd had a hysterectomy, and she loved jewelry, let's put it that way. Anywho, the bottom line: all missing persons and unidentified people should go into this website nationwide so we can identify the people that we have languishing in our morgues. It's really the bottom line. This was a fellow that was in our morgue for almost 7 years. He did not look like this when he was in our morgue, unfortunately. He washed up on the shore of Lincoln County in 2007, I believe, and we identified him in, I think, 2010. So we had him for about 3 years. But his head was gone. He had been in the water for a long, long time, and we only had really his thoracic cavity. But we got a DNA profile off of the remains. We kept him because we knew eventually we would ID him. And his family is actually from Washington State. They're from Seattle. And they gave their oral swab standards to their law enforcement agency. Their swabs went to the national database. Their DNA profile got uploaded, and they hit the remains that were in the Portland area morgue. So it works really, really well. The submissions that we send to the University of North Texas can be bone, it can be tissue. If it looks good enough, if it's not as degraded as I normally see, it can be blood. It can also be hair. We get DNA off of hair quite a bit. So that input into NamUs and that unidentified person system can trigger leads for investigators, and it can also ID people. So this is just real quickly how that match occurs. All of these DNA profiles going into the same system, and you think, how in the world does that happen? So if you think about it, it's different silos of information, different silos of DNA profiles. One of them is your unidentified person. That's that yellow silo at the top. And it's compared to 4 other different silos. So your family reference standards, the moms and the dads who give their oral swab standards, the brothers and the sisters whose siblings are missing. This is compared directly to our unidentified person. Direct reference samples, that's things like toothbrushes. That's compared directly to our unidentified persons. Forensic evidence. We might have blood at a crime scene that was left by our dead skeleton at some point after 3 or 4 years. That gets compared to our unidentified person. And lastly, but interestingly enough, we also compare to our convicted offender profiles. And I've identified probably almost a dozen people that hit on their own convicted offender profiles when they were incarcerated for a crime in the past. So it's an interesting way to identify somebody, but it happens. So this database, this national database named NamUs, was beta tested in 2006. They worked the bugs out. We started it up in Oregon and in Washington State in 2007, and Oregon has identified over 14 people at this point. What can you do? I end with this because I want you to go away with this based on the fact that this is a national public website, and it can only work if you populate it. So, talk to people, and you might not think that you know anybody that has a missing person in their family, but I think we all know somebody who's maybe been touched by something like this. So cruise the website, www.namus.gov. Tell your loved ones about the database, pass the word. You can always email me with questions, nikki.vance@state.or.us. I'd love to talk to you. Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening. I'll be posting more episodes soon on lots of topics, including medical cannabis, and also what's going to happen when the Cascadia subduction zone has a giant earthquake. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or what's coming up at our Science on Tap events in Portland and Vancouver, please visit our website at viaproductions.org or check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/scienceontapORWA. That last part stands for Oregon and Washington. We've also just launched an Indiegogo fundraising campaign to help us produce more events and podcasts. If you like what you've heard, please go to our website, viaproductions.org, and click on the fundraiser link for more info. You can also go to indiegogo.com and search for the campaign Science Education for Adults. We're planning for the fundraiser to go through early December 2014, and anything helps. Thanks. Before I wrap up, I'd like to say a special thank you to my volunteers, the Minions. They do a ton of things behind the scenes, like selling our new t-shirts and pint glasses, and editing the fundraising video. The Minions are Scott Fry, Michelle Herman, Sam Lauk, Ashley Miller, Rita Nygren, Katie Parsons, Stephen Perry, Antje Spethman, and Chris Trone. Thank you guys. I couldn't do this without you. Also, a final thank you to Jonathan Coulton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set as our theme music.
You're a heart-shaped box of strings and wire in one badass fucking fractal, and you're just